This week, you may have noticed in our weekly e-newsletter, if you don't get that, you can sign up for that by scanning the QR code on the back of your bulletin. Now, bedtime stories. So many stories begin with what phrase? Once upon a time. They were a little better on that one. Once upon a time. So let me share a story with you that begins that way. Once upon a time, there was a merchant in Venice who owned a large sum of money to a moneylender, an ancient loan shark. The moneylender was old and mean and wanted a wife. He knew the merchant had a charming daughter, so he proposed a bargain. He would cancel the debt in exchange for the merchant's daughter as his wife. The merchant and the daughter were horrified. So the scheming moneylender proposed a plan. Okay, all right, we'll let fate decide. I will put a black pebble and a white pebble in a bag, and then your daughter will have to put her hand in there and pull out one of the pebbles. If she pulls out a black pebble, she will become my wife, and your debt will be canceled. If she pulls out a white pebble, I will cancel the debt, and you both walk away with no obligation. If your daughter refuses this offer, I will have you thrown in jail, and your daughter will surely starve with no one to look after her. Well, after discussing the options, the merchant and his charming, clever daughter reluctantly agreed. The moneylender, the merchant, and the daughter were standing in a garden when this took place on a pebbled path. So the moneylender pulled a coin out of his pocket, pulled a coin bag out of his pocket, emptied it of coins, and picked up 2 pebbles which he dropped in the bag. Now, if this was a Disney movie, we'd have a song right now. The daughter was filled with fright. But sharp-eyed, she noticed that the cunning moneylender picked up 2 black pebbles and put them in the bag. Now she was truly frightened. The moneylender turned to her and asked her to put her hand in the bag and to pick out a pebble, and that would decide her fate and her father's fate. By this time, a crowd had gathered around them. Now, let me pause here. What would you have done if you had been the daughter? Here's some options. Basically, as I see it, you would have 3 options. She should refuse to take the pebble, but then her father would end up in jail. One option. Another option, she should demand to see both pebbles in the bag before she picks one, but she risked angering the moneylender and the deal being called off. Third, she should just take the black pebble that she knows there's 2 in the bag and agree to marry the moneylender to take one hit for the family. 3 options. Well, here's what the daughter did. She put her hand in the bag and drew out a pebble. However, without opening her hand to reveal its color, she fumbled and let the pebble fall to the path, where it immediately mixed in with all the others. "Oh, how clumsy of me," she said. "Never mind, however, for if you look in the bag, you will be able to tell which pebble I pulled out, which pebble I dropped by the color of the one remaining in the bag," which was, of course, a black pebble. So it had to be accepted that she had picked out a white pebble. So the debt was forgiven, The moneylender walked away, still a bachelor, without his money or a new wife, because he dare not admit his own dishonesty in front of a crowd. Now let me ask you this. Is this a tale of dishonesty and trickery? Should the daughter be praised for her cleverness? Or is this a tale of shrewdness and cleverness? Who could out-shrewd who? Sometimes it's hard to decide, isn't it? Sometimes it's hard to see just black and white, just right and wrong, just one way, not the other. Stories can be tricky like that. And the stories that Jesus shared were no less tricky. The stories that Jesus shared are called parables. And this morning, Joanna read a parable in Luke 16. The parable is actually titled, The Shrewd Manager. And this parable, if we're honest with one another, likely leaves us in a bit of a quandary. Let me ask you again about this parable. Is the parable in Luke 16 with the crafty steward about dishonesty and trickery? Or is it about shrewdness and cleverness? Or is it all four, right? But here's a question. What might Jesus be offering us in this story? First, let me say that if we approach parables as just a lesson as simply a morality lesson, we may struggle with answering that. But if we look at parables, if we look at these short stories of Jesus as a story where every word and element adds to the meaning and tells us who God is and who we are called to be, then parables, like much of Scripture, offer us many layers of meaning. Parables have many, many layers of understanding. When one digs below the surface of the words on the page, you will find many possible meanings. David Platt says this: parables are a mirror into which each of us can look to examine God and see our better or lesser selves. Parables are a mirror into which each of us can look to examine God and see our better or worse, lesser selves. And then he says this, and we might just be surprised. Let's go back to our parable and break it down a little bit. This is Luke 16, verses 1 through 4. This is from The Message, Eugene Peterson's The Message. That's the one that's printed and the one that I'm sharing. Jesus said to his disciples, "There was once a rich man who had a manager. He got reports that the manager had been taking advantage of his position by running up huge personal expenses. So he called him in and said, 'What's this I hear about you? You're fired, and I want a complete audit of your books.' Now, at this point, the manager says to himself, 'What am I going to do? I've lost my job as manager. I'm not strong enough for a laboring job. I'm too proud to beg. I've got a plan. Here's what I'll do. And then when I'm turned out into the street, people will take me into their homes.'" Commentator William Barclay says this: "This is a story about a choice set of rascals as one could meet anywhere in life. Who were some of those rascals? A rich man. Sometimes in other translations, they refer to him as a landowner. Landowners were often absentee landlords. So they used one of their slaves and put that one in charge of running their estate. The one in charge of running the estate, the manager, or some translations say steward, they were in charge with what had been entrusted to them. And often one of those responsibilities of a manager or a steward was collecting debts, like rent, like a middle management position. In this story, the manager has been caught being dishonest, and he knows he is in trouble, so he begins talking to himself. Michael Card says that when a character begins talking to himself, that is always a bad sign in Luke. He is genuinely a desperate man. He is losing his livelihood and in many ways his identity. Out of desperation, he calls in those who owe his master, and he scrubs the books, subtracting from each bill that he had nefariously added for himself and asking the debtor to write out a new bill. He lowers their bills by significant amounts. Now, admittedly, he is hoping to gain favor with the debtors for when he himself loses his job. So maybe not the best of intentions in mind. And then what happens? What is the result of all of his scheming, all of his trickery? Listen to Luke 16:8. Now here's a surprise. The master praised the crooked manager. 16:8, that same verse in the NRSV says this, and his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. He was praised for acting shrewdly. He was commended even after being dishonest. Where's the justice in that? My sense of justice says he's got to pay something for what he did. Does anybody else think that? Really, Jesus? Where's the justice? Another thing about a parable is it has an ending that you don't expect. And I think Jesus does that on purpose because God works like that. God works in unforeseen places and unexpected people and in unanticipated ways. When grace gets loose, watch out. Our story, though, our parable, it's a little bit bothersome, isn't it? Is Jesus saying that if you're between a rock and a hard place, be dishonest? Well, if we read it on the surface, maybe. But remember, parables aren't morality lessons or meant to be read simply. Hear these next verses in Luke 16. I think they provide a bit of meaning for us. Now, here's a surprise. The master praised the crooked manager, and why? Because he knew how to look after himself. Streetwise people are smarter in this regard than law-abiding citizens. They are on constant alert, looking for angles, surviving by their wits. I want you to be smart in the same way, but for what is right, using every adversity to stimulate you to creative survival, to concentrate your attention on the bare essentials so you'll live, really live and not complacently just get by on good behavior. And not complacently just get by on good behavior. Not get by on just following the rules, on coming to church on Sundays, on letting somebody in front of you in traffic. It's not enough to just get by on good behavior, because how much is good enough if you keep a checklist? Jesus says, I want you to be smart in the same way. I want you to be on constant alert, but for what is right. In other words, use every opportunity you have for what is right. Be creative. Be daring. Be bold. What do you have to lose when you're serving God? See, if we look at the parables over these next 6 weeks as merely morality lessons, we may miss some of that nuance, some of that meaning. Dr. Amy Jill Levine, she is one of the most respected Jewish New Testament scholars. Yes, I said that right. Jewish New Testament scholars. She says this parable in Luke 16 defies any fully satisfactory explanation, but it may help to ask ourselves, what does this story, this parable, have to do with who God is and who we are called to be? What does this story have to do with who God is and what we are called to do? What if the master in this story is God, and we are the managers, the stewards? Then the parable reimagined might sound something like this, as Reverend Mark Havel writes. There is this God, full, not of oil or wheat or things you can track in a ledger, but full of love and mercy and grace and forgiveness. And this God had a disciple whom God charged with sharing those blessings with the world around him. When God found out the disciple was squandering what he'd asked him to tend to care for, and to share, God summoned the disciple and said to him, what is this I hear about you? That you're being selfish? That you're holding grudges and judging others? That you're counting sins and keeping people out and pretending that you have more power than you do or should? If all of that's true, if you've been withholding grace and blessing and mercy and love, you cannot be my disciple anymore. I can't have you going around pretending you do all of this in my name for the sake of the kingdom. So the disciple said to himself, what am I going to do now that God, my master, is taking this position and privilege away from me? How could I have been so selfish and blind to those needs of the world around me? How could I have withheld from so many others what was so generously shared with me in the first place? I'm not strong enough to do all this on my own. I'm as ashamed as anyone to need the forgiveness of God, and I never earned any of it in the first place. I know what I'll do. I'll do what I should have done all along. I'll be as generous and as kind and as forgiving with others as I woulda, coulda, shoulda been all along, which is all that was ever asked of me in the first place. So summoning God's children one by one, The disciple asked the first, "What is it you feel like you owe to God? For what sin are you holding on to such guilt?" And when this lost and broken soul confessed his sin, the disciple said to him, "Don't worry about it another minute. Your God, our Master, is a gracious, loving God of forgiveness and mercy. Receive the good news of that. Go on your way and return the favor of this kind of forgiveness to someone in your life." And the disciple did this same with another fellow sinner and another and another, extending grace, announcing forgiveness, and expressing love for the least of those in the world around him. He got so crafty and so creative, so generous, and so extravagant with the love of God for all people that some called him foolish and reckless and unfaithful even. But God smiled, because the disciple had finally learned where true value and real riches and actual worth and new life are found in this world. Friends, what if we are called to be as crafty with God's love? What if we're called to be so generous with God's grace and so creative with God's forgiveness and mercy? What might that look like? What if we are called to do that? How are you doing with that? Or as Dr. Phyllis said, how's that working out for you? This morning we had the baptism of the precious baby boy, William Mark Manally. In our United Methodist Baptismal Covenant, as you saw, the parents and sponsors vow to nurture William in the Christian faith. And we, church, in the same covenant, vowed to nurture William in the Christian faith. Now, today, that seems like an easy promise. He's a precious tiny baby. And he's a baby that will grow up to be whomever and whatever God created him to be. We love a good baby baptism. We don't know who he will grow up to be, but we make that vow boldly and creatively as a community of faith. Let us not forget to be just as shrewd, just as extravagant with God's grace and love for the baby that William is now, William 10 years from now, and William 20 years from now. And let's do the same for one another and all of God's precious children when we leave this place. Let us be shrewd and creative and bold with God's grace and love for one another, for everyone, no matter what. There wasn't anything in the covenant that said, if William eats all his vegetables, he will be loved. If William gets all A's, he will be loved. If William chooses to live his life this way, he will be loved. We don't do that. We make a vow that we're going to so generously share God's love with William, with the family, with one another. And let us do that outside of these walls, friends. Let it be so, Lord. Let it be so. Amen.